Good morning. I hope everybody's up and at it this morning. I wish we had our cup of coffee in front of us and our coffee cake and we're happily out at St. Mark's on campus. But in as much as we're not, I'm excited to see that so many have shown up, and I must say I feel a very special connection to the class of 2020. I'm Kathleen Fisher, and many of us have met before. I must say that over the last 6 years, I have met regularly with a group of St. Mark's parents. And in some ways, I feel like I've really watched you and your boys grow up together. So to be at this momentous juncture is a real privilege, and I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to share just a little bit about, I want to be sure that all of our pieces are working smoothly together. I have to confess that doing a Zoom webinar is a new experience for me. So I'm hoping it's going without a glitch. I see the little red recording light blinking, so we must be good. You can pick this up. We'll be sending out a link in about 24 hours in case you want to watch it again or share it with someone in your family. I would like to begin by introducing myself. I come to this work with a very unusual background. I actually began my career as a registered nurse. I worked in the hospital in labor and delivery. And some of you have heard me say, it didn't take me long to realize I have a very bad attitude about handing a newborn to a 14, 15-year-old kid. And I thought, I don't need to be in here. I need to be out somewhere helping kids figure this out so we don't do this. And so I left hospital nursing, went to community health, but still the kids that I was meeting were sexually active, infected, pregnant. I was already too late. So I went back and picked up education credentials and taught in DISD, wrote curriculum for them, did a lot of community education, left that work for a while and did advertising, marketing, and sales. And about 25 years ago, maybe a little longer now, I returned to that work when the youth minister at my church said, I sure wish we had somebody that would talk to kids about dating and sex. And I looked at my 12-year-old daughter and said, oh, I'll do that. And she went, oh, not my mother. Oh my gosh. And anyway, I re-entered the work again that I love so much. When I would do a sexuality weekend, I would insist that the parents come before I spoke to the kids. And the result of that was that parents said, well, we really like what you say about dating and sex, but what about curfew? What about allowance? What about homework? Could you teach a class on parenting? And I'm happy to say 20 plus years later, I sure can do that. I've written a couple of books. I have added to my list of services individual and family coaching, group coaching, and most recently doing reading groups on books that I think are so important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of those this morning as we go through our time. I feel very privileged to be with you guys today, and I just want to say what an accomplishment it is and what a precious and tenuous moment we're all in. I'd like to say that I want to be clear about the goals that we're going to work on. First of all, if there was one byline for the next 6 to 12 months in any graduating senior's life, but especially in these current times, it would be to be prepared or be preparing for the unexpected. And may I just take my hat off to you right now, because boy, oh boy, are you guys right in the thick of that. When you think back to December or January, when all those college apps launched, you knew there were going to be some unexpected things, but I'll bet nobody imagined that we would be meeting together in a Zoom webinar today. So we're going to talk a lot about preparing for the unexpected, but I want to just say you are doing it right this minute. In addition, I want to talk about the continuing importance of your stepping back from your kid's life. And I'm not saying stepping out, but we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like. Secondly, we're going to be talking about some new tools or some tools that you've been using that you're going to be using even more in this process of changing gears. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of your kid's departure on the whole family, not just on the kid. We tend to get real focused on the kid, forgetting, of course, that they live within the context of our family. So that means all of us are going to be impacted. I have to smile. Some of you have heard this so often that you can now recite it. And if I were in person, I'd say, job of a parent number one, and everyone would yell, safety. Safety is, in my world, there are three jobs of a parent. The first one is safety, which is fairly straightforward. It began with look both ways when you cross the street. You have to wear a helmet when you're riding your bike. Now it might sound more like, give me your keys. I saw you drive in without your seatbelt, except we know seatbelt compliance in teenagers is actually pretty darn good. Safety is one of your jobs, and it continues to bring you back in the mix. And I mention it because I suspect this year there could be some safety issues, and it'll bring you back in the mix. The second job of a parent is decency. And decency is what makes parenting young adults and adolescents so exhausting. Many of them are doing pretty darn well in this whole decency, meaning they can make values judgment, that their actions are consistent with their values. As we're moving into young adulthood, that begins to be what we're looking for under the heading of decency. Having said that, in these next few months, as they head into college away from a lot of adult supervision, we expect that our kids are likely to hit some real decency challenges. And with that, they're going to have to make some judgment calls. So embedded in that is, wouldn't it be great if they were able to seek you out as counsel and guidance to kind of talk through some of the stuff that's hitting them once they get to college? The third job is exiting your kid's life. And here you are. I imagine this as a metaphor. I don't know if any of you all drive a manual transmission, but if you do, you remember that there's a shift between the accelerator and the brake, or the clutch and the accelerator. And as you're easing off of one and coming on with the other, there's some hiccup that go on. But that's what we're doing right now. And it is time for us to be easing back as our kids come on in their responsibility. So I challenge you right now. It is easy for us to get caught up with, oh my gosh, what if this happens? What if that happens? And so on and so forth. But I would like to challenge you with the thought that if everything were to go as well as it could possibly go for the next year, for the next 2 years, for the next 5 years, what would that look like? What would it sound like? What would it feel like? We do not do well to parent out of the negative side. That's not to say there aren't some negative things. It's not to say that, we're not aware that there are threats coming up in their world. But I think it's very useful for us to begin with, if everything went well, what would that look like? Because you know what the truth is? The truth is a lot is going well right now. They are getting it right. It does sound right. So that when their younger brother or sister annoys them, they kind of back away from it for the first time. That didn't happen 3 or 4 years ago. And so we're already beginning to see what this looks like, sounds like, and feels like when they begin to make headway. So it's useful. I hope that what it will look like, sound like, and feel like is, first of all, self-efficacy, and second of all, self-reliance. Now, I'd like to break those two words down because I think that they undergird your and my continuing role as a parent, our effective role. So let's look at that word self-efficacy, first of all. The term efficacy comes from the same root as effective or efficient. And self-efficacy is the belief that I have the power to do something which will impact the outcome of this situation. So for example, if I've got a terrible grade in Spanish and I just come in and say, oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do. I'm just a terrible Spanish speaker. It's just hopeless. That would be an example of not feeling self-efficacy. If a kid comes in and says, so I got this really bad grade, but I've made an appointment with the teacher to talk about it, and I've talked with a kid who made an A, and he's going to share his flashcards with me. It's going to be, that's an example of I am doing something that is going to impact the outcome. Now, this broadens itself way, 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 way beyond academic life into there's something that I can do to impact the way my roommate is treating me. There's something that I can do to impact the fact that my budget for the semester is shot and it's only October. I have the power to get a job. I have a power to rein in my spending. I have a power to approach my mom and dad for more money. Self-efficacy is that belief that there is something I can do that will impact the outcome. You're already seeing it, I suspect. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea when you do to say, you know, I'm really impressed. You're kind of taking the bull by the horns in this situation, because they are. Now, the second piece of this growing up that you're going to be hearing, I hope, is because of self-efficacy, they begin to rely on themselves rather than you. Now, this is at once a good news, bad news thing, because in some ways we kind of really like them to rely on us, right? But as they are growing and going out the door, we want to see them initiating the activity, initiating the solution, initiating the reservation, the doctor's appointment that they need when they have the sore throat, whatever it is. We may actually be down the line and not even hear about a decision until after it's been made. I've decided to change majors. I've decided to drop out of the team that I had signed up for. This self-reliance, when we see it, is actually an excellent indication that our kids are getting it right and that we are deserving a pat on the back. What can we say? Julie Lithcote-Hames is like my new best friend. She and I are best buds, and she is the author of a book entitled How to Raise an Adult. If you haven't read it already, oh my gosh, buy it, start it today, immediately. It is not too late, absolutely not too late. And she comes at her book from a couple of different vantage points that make her quite remarkable. The first one is that she was the dean of freshmen at Stanford for 10 years. This lady has seen more 18-year-olds, more competent, capable 18-year-olds than you and I can even shake a stick at. The second thing is she's raising her own 2 teenagers in Palo Alto, so she's pretty familiar with the kind of environment that our kids have grown up in. Finally, she is wickedly smart and wickedly funny. You can catch her on YouTube. You can certainly catch her in How to Raise an Adult, and I really recommend it. I recommend it so much that when I got through reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to process this and teach it to my clients? And so I had to actually invent a new format called a reading group, where we read the book together and we talk about it in 50-page segments, and then talk about how we're going to implement that 50 pages within our families. So in her book, she suggests that our children like ours, have lived a checklisted childhood, that the community, the parents, the school create a checklist. 4 years varsity sport, check. Eagle Scout, check. Mission trip, check. Trip abroad, check. That the checklist is so jammed that our kids have precious little time for slack, first of all, where they discover themselves and their own preferences and their own capabilities and pleasures. But secondly, where they have the opportunity to gain experience and mastery of what she calls the alternate or the different kind of checklist. So let's take a look at what some of those things include. She says by the time a kid is 18 years old, that's your guys, they ought to be able to do the following things. First of all, they ought to be able to talk with strangers. What would that mean? It would mean they could go off campus and open a bank account nearby. It would mean they could go to their advisor who they've never met before and introduce themselves. It would mean they could stand on the rapid transit corner stop and ask somebody, does this bus get me to so-and-so? So the ability to discern the difference between the, what do you think, 90% of strangers who are safe and helpful from the 10% who aren't, they need to learn to be able to talk to strangers. By the way, practicing making their own dental appointment, their own doctor's appointment, getting their papers filled out to take for dorm. All of those are excellent practices at speaking to strangers. The second thing Lithcote Hames says our kids ought to be able to do is to navigate his way around. It starts, as I said, with standing on the rapid transit corner stop and saying, does this bus get me to whatever I want to go to? But it also might include reading a map. It also might be checking in Southwest terminal to see, or not terminal, but their website to see what flights can I get from Dallas to where I need to be and what time do they go. Learning to navigate is going to increasingly become part of their job, and horrifyingly so when they get in touch with you next spring and say, hey, me and my buddies have decided to go to New Orleans. We might want to see about how much we want them to be able to navigate on their own. The third thing Lithcote Hames recommends, and this has been a work in progress, hasn't it, for the last 4 or 5 years, they need to be able to manage their assignments, their own workloads, their own deadlines. What happens when they mess up and they don't get their work done in time? What do they do then? And that is not your job anymore. And so in a moment, we'll talk a little bit about when that doesn't happen. What is your role? Hopefully things like college essays and deadlines for applications moved into their domain and out of yours under the heading of manage their own workload. The next thing that Lithcote Hames encourages is that they need to learn to contribute to the running of a household. I'd just like to add to that. When did chores fall out of fashion? If I asked for you to raise your hands, I suspect that most of you did chores when you were growing up. And if I said, keep your hands up if your kids do chores before the last 6 weeks, I suspect there wouldn't be many hands in the air. We have our kids do chores not because it's easier for them to feed the dog, take out the trash, unload the groceries. We don't do it because it's easier, because by golly, it is not easier. It is a pain in the neck, right? We do it because learning to run a household is an essential survival skill. Unless you send them with hired help that lives in, sooner or later, they got to figure that out. This last 4 to 6 weeks at home, I hear reported from the front line that many of you have household help and many of you have asked your household help to not show up. And what has happened in lieu of that is that you and your kids, I hope, have begun to pick up some of that slack. And there have been some great, great stories. I'm here to tell you, there have been some great stories about kids learning to do laundry. But I want you to keep in mind that as a parent, actually helping them become competent and confident of being able to do those things is something that we just hope that this time next year, it'll be no big deal for them to make a trip to the grocery store, or for them to make a simple meal, or for them to run a load of laundry before they go to bed tonight. So this is one of the different kind of checklist items that she encourages. Handling interpersonal relationships is another one. And I know that your guys this year have probably had a lot of experience at that. They've had to get recommendations from teachers or coaches. Many of them are navigating relationships with girlfriends or girl pals. And if you hadn't noticed, girls have a lot of drama. Our boys notice it right away. And where they were in 4th or 5th grade, and we might have been involved in sometimes directly handling the relationship, calling the other parent, sometimes just coaching them from the sidelines, we're going to see our boys more and more relying on themselves to resolve these interpersonal relationship things. They remain trying. And by the way, You and I know that when they have roommates, dorm mates, fraternity brothers, teammates, that they've never met, they've never dealt with before, there's likely to be a new spike in some challenges in handling these things. The next one is to cope with the ups and downs of life. I have been saying to some of you for a number of years that I wish that we could imagine that dealing with the ups and downs of life was kind of like having a toolkit. Okay, so let's just hit a pause button a minute on this one, because I want us to think a little bit about what ups and downs do you imagine might come their way this coming year. I could imagine that they don't get the roommate they want, or they get the roommate they want and it turns out not to be the roommate they like. They didn't get the classes they want. The classes turn out to be harder. The girl that they were in such a swoon with the first 2 weeks of college turns out to be a drama queen and they don't want any part of her. They don't make the team. They don't get the fraternity they want. The other kids that are at the school that they go to already know each other and exclude our kid. All of these could be things that kind of throw them a curveball. What tools does your kid currently have in his toolbox? So if I ask right now, if we were in person, I'd say, what tools are in your personal toolbox? And if I went around the room, gosh, I see that we have about 50 people on this call. We would hear at least 50 different tools in toolkits. We'd hear things like, when I have a curveball thrown at me, I run 5 miles. I read a book. I watch my favorite sappy movie. I have a glass of wine. I speed too fast. I call my mom. I call my best friend. I call somebody who cares. I pet my kitty. I play my guitar. I put my fist through the glass window. I scream and yell at somebody. Okay, did you hear the shift in there? Because some of those tools are positive tools, and some of them actually create more problems than they solved. So let me return to the question, what has our boy got in his toolkit? And I'm thinking of a story right now about a kid from a fancy private North Dallas school who, if he won the valedictorian, he was a salutatorian. And he was the captain of his varsity sport. He was an amazing, amazing kid. And it didn't hurt that he was handsome. He gets up to a school on the East Coast. It was pretty far north. He thinks he's going to be a walk-on on the team, but they don't want him. At the opening freshman meeting, they ask everybody who's been valedictorian or salutatorian to stand up. Everybody who's been a varsity captain, stand up. Everybody who made state choir, state orchestra, lead in the play, recognized nationally as a debater, all of those things. He said by the time the president of the college was through, he looked around the room of 1,000 kids and virtually everybody was standing. And he said to himself, dang, this is not the same group anymore. So he launches in. He's always been an excellent student. And guess what? The classes there are really, really hard. Not only that, but it was he that gave me the information that all the guys that lived in his dorm, all the guys on campus, I'm sure not all the guys, already knew each other from boarding school, and he didn't know anybody. So when they got together, they didn't really include him. He didn't know the jokes. And by Thanksgiving, he was in a pretty serious funk. When I asked him what were the tools in his toolkit, he said his main tool was distance running, that when he had encountered difficulties back in Dallas, he'd gone out and run it, kind of helped him clear his head, helped him think things through. He felt better when he got back, but the ice and snow had already set in where he was and he couldn't go on distance runs anymore. He was out of tools. And I asked him to think about other tools in his toolkit. He couldn't. I mean, this is a really bright kid. And he said to me, almost in a heart-wrenching way, I've never faced a time like this before. It turns out that you and I learn about these tools of self-survival generally when we're in a survival mode. So think about your kid. You may want to have a conversation about it. You might want to have a dinner conversation about it. Ask dad, what are his tools? Ask brother, sister. Too bad grandma and grandpa are not at the table. We all have different tools. Writing in your journal is one of my favorites. What kind of tools does he have to cope with the ups and downs of his own life? We'll talk more about where you fit into that. We hope, Julie Lithcote-Hames suggests, that our kids need to know how to earn and manage money by now. That's like a whole topic of conversation, which I hope you've begun and are well into by now. And finally, oh, our boys need to know how to take healthy risks that do not endanger them. We've seen some, I suspect, the last year to 18 months that were a little scary. And we hope that our kids are beginning to learn to think through the consequences of those choices that they're making. By the way, Lithcote-Hames adds this little PS. Our kids must be able to do all these things without resorting to calling a parent. If they're still calling us to ask how, they have not attained the skill yet. Yet is my word. But if they're still calling you, and I literally have had a kid call from another city and say, Mom, I'm at the corner of such and such and such and such. Can you tell me how to get to? I'm like, oh my God, you have a cell phone and a Google map on it. Find yourself, buddy. I also want to add here that Lithcote-Hames says, we do our children harm. We do them harm when we do something for them they already know how to do, when we do something for them they almost know how to do, or when we parent out of our need rather than theirs. That last one really catches us on the hooks, because sometimes the truth of it is I do this because it helps me feel better. And look, I don't have any trouble with that, and I have even been guilty of it. But I think it's important for us to claim it when we do that. So it might sound something like, you're home from school for fall break, and I know you can do your laundry, and I know you're very competent, but I kind of need to mom you a little bit. Would you mind if I did your laundry? Would you mind if I fixed you dinner? I need it. I need the hug. We're allowed to do it when we claim it as our own. And increasingly, there are things we have and that we have need of. And we're going to talk about those as we move through our time together this morning. So the question is, hang on, just a teensy little adjustment on my end. What do we risk if we don't let them grow up? If we continue to intervene in a way that's not healthy? And I just want to point out to you that the source on this next piece of information is none other than Slate magazine. And in Slate, they write, young adults who do not grow up are unable to navigate normal relationships, like their roommate, like what if the TV is on too loud, like being left out of a social group. There are just some normal relationship things that our kids have to be able to do. If they haven't grown up, they may have trouble doing it. They may have trouble feeling incompetent, such that they won't take on tasks, such that they call and say, Mom, I need you to open a bank account. Mom, I need you to contact my advisor. Whoa, 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 whoa. They're likely, if they're in the growing up process, to feel anxious doing grown-up stuff. Now, let me just point out, we've sort of inflated anxious to being a horrible thing. I want to remind you that actually feeling anxiety is a normal thing. And I would love it if in your conversation, you could normalize feeling anxious and maybe even step it down by what you call it: worried, concerned, unsure about. Do you hear the difference? When we escalate it to anxiety, all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to do this? Anxiety is a normal feeling. And I'd like to give you some way to frame it, maybe talking about it with your kids and yourself. Anxiety is a yellow flag that says to us, there's something going on here. this might be a little bigger than you've done before. It might be a little uncertain. You might not be exactly sure how to navigate this. Pay attention. So anxiety is a yellow flag that suggests we need to pay attention. And so if our kid calls us and says, I'm anxious, I'm worried, and what do you need to pay attention to? What would make this better? What would take this down a notch besides getting drunk or smoking dope? Okay, because that actually has some downsides to solving the feeling of being anxious. So when our kids get anxious about when they feel uncertain about doing grown-up stuff, when they feel a little confused about doing grown-up stuff. By the way, confused is one of your new favorite words. Your kid can afford to be confused by something. And you can afford to say to him, yeah, I could see how that might be a little confusing. Okay, let's talk it through. Who are some people who might know how to help you? How accessible are they to you? Do you hear me doing something different? Because we're going to come back and talk about your role at that. Kids who have not grown up are unable to think through and make sense to a good course of action. So that's the thing, to be self-reliant, to feel self-efficacy. They have to be able to think it through and come up with a pretty good course of action. Likewise, Slate continues, kids who haven't grown up often have pretty poor judgment, and they do actually mess up a lot. By the way, as a mother of a kid with ADD, I can tell you that independence for a kid with ADD or learning differences, because poor judgment, we may see a fair amount. And not only will we want to give counsel, but we may want to help them find people on their campus that they can seek for good counsel. Likewise, kids who have not grown up as much may suffer poor mental health, frustrations, breakups, false starts, thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be my new best friend. Whoops, they don't share the same values I do. They may be unable to address hardships. And let me just say that the last 4 to 6 weeks have been pretty much a hardship. And if you want to get a measure of how your kids are doing, you might take a look at it now. Having said that, I certainly don't think any of us have done 100% great. And I'm thinking of posting an online free webinar on resilience and fostering it in ourselves and our kids. So stay tuned or sign up on my website, which will come at the end of my presentation today. We do not expect our kids to be getting this hardship thing 100% right. But I think many of us are getting some pretty reassuring feedback that they are being able to handle this and move forward. Another way that we will know if our kids are not doing so well is that when we offer help, or best of all, guidance, as opposed to actually taking over the reins and running their lives, they may get pretty ticked off at us and kick us in the teeth. That can be a very useful piece of feedback from us. If we offer advice and our kids are hostile about it, maybe we don't need to be offering it. And we can end that conversation very abruptly by, I have some ideas that might be helpful. If you decide you'd like to hear them, let me know. And back away. They're trying to figure it out, and they may resent our intrusion, and it is intrusion at this point. Which takes us to one of my favorite sayings: mistakes plus consequences equals learning, unless we parents prohibit the consequences from befalling them. Mistakes plus consequences equals learning. If we remove the consequence, the kid pretty much has to take the lesson again. Now, those of you who've been around with me know that my corollary to this is the sooner we can allow the consequence to befall them, the cheaper it is, in both money and heartache, a lot of times. So that if they didn't get their assignment in on the right time and they end up flunking the class freshman year, oh well, better than if they didn't get the project in their senior year and their senior project was required for graduation in engineering and they didn't get it turned in, and you get to pay for a whole nother semester for them to complete it. So mistakes plus consequences equals learning. And if you've been stepping in to remove the consequences, The sooner we can do that, the better it would be if we would step away. They have a lot to learn, and hopefully you've seen them learning lots. And there are going to be a lot of mistakes before they get it right mostly. Now, I'd like to highlight that getting it right mostly, that we do not expect. If I ask you right now to raise your hand if you have a perfect kid, there wouldn't be one single hand that goes up. Certainly not mine. So we need to step back when our kid messes up and kind of talk ourselves off the ledge before we talk them off the ledge, and say something to one another like, did you expect them to get it 100% right? Okay, so this is part of that 90 or that 6% that they messed up. And we don't expect them to get it right. And that leads me to one of my very favorite expressions, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. And I say that laughingly because I suspect we're going to see some crises in the next 6 months. They're going to be all different kinds. I lost my passport. I lost my bank account. I'm locked out of classes and I can't register. My girlfriend is a train wreck. My best friend is a train wreck. My best friend is now dating my girlfriend. How many complications can we have? Here's the point about a crisis. First of all, a crisis, the very definition of crisis is generally, we have these values and something comes crashing into it, okay? I thought my value was that me and my girlfriend were gonna be exclusive. We're just gonna date each other. And we're at college for a week now, and I just saw on the internet, social media, her making out, her looking like she's drunk and making out with some guy I've never seen before. Okay, the crisis is, first of all, has to do with loyalty and fidelity and this post. And so what we couldn't talk about yesterday, our son didn't want to hear anything about the fact that this relationship with his girlfriend might not last for life. Oh boy, it is on the table to talk about today. And so never let a good crisis go to waste. What we couldn't talk about yesterday is now really open. The second part of that is don't rush. Hit the pause button and give yourself some thinking time and give your boy some thinking time. And it allows you to get clear about what's the most important part of this that I need to address, and what can I save for later? And how am I going to move into this with him in a way that, I don't know about you, but my long-term goal with my young adults is to keep that line of communication open. And in fact, if I can, to enhance it. And so that he and I can continue this wonderful connection we've had. Under the heading, I'm shifting gears now a little bit. And part 2 is to begin to think about planning for the unexpected. And that sounds like a ridiculous thing. How can we plan for something we don't even know? Good question. I'd like to say right now that among the unexpected things you're already working about is graduation festivities, your spring break plans. And I know some of you are beginning to think about, what is fall going to look like? Is fall going to look like? Let's don't go too far on this, how to plan for the unexpected, but we've got some things out ahead of us. So let's take a look at that a little bit. I'd like to begin by discerning the difference for you between expectations and expectancy. Expectations are defined. My expectation is that you will have a 3.5 or better. My expectation for you is that you will make the varsity team at college. My expectation for you is that you will call every Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Expectations are specific. They have generally been made unilaterally. A lot of times our kids didn't even buy into it. We've already decided that this is the way it's going to be. And I'd like to spread that to a broader concept of expectancy. A sense of expectancy that you're going to have some great intellectual liveliness where you go. Some expectancy that you're going to find some new relationships that, gosh, I hope they're good for a long, long time. They're going to help you learn more about yourself and more about others. This sense of expectancy doesn't have such a narrow definition, and it is bilateral or unilateral, where we all are checking into it. And a great question is, what are you hoping for? So that you begin to hear the expectancy in your kid's voice. I'd like to say that expectations are often a setup for disappointment, ours or his. You and I often, by the way, are not sharing the same expectations. He thought that roommate, he heard you talk about your roommate who was a lifelong friend. His expectation was that his roommate would also be a lifelong friend, only to discover that his roommate shoots up once a week, and that's inconsistent with his values or some such. True story. That the examples I mentioned are not ones I cooked up. They're ones that I've heard from kids, and they can be quite distressing. Let's take a dose of reality. This comes to us from the American College Health Association. Their survey of mental health on 153 different campuses across the United States. So this is not just private schools, it's not just big public state schools, it's not just exclusive Ivies. This is across the board, including some from community colleges. Here's some amazing statistics. First of all, 1 in 4 first-year college students will not return to the same school next year. So your kid's got a 25% chance that he's going to get there, and that is not going to be his place for one reason or another. 66% of first-year students report admitting homesick or very lonely. So this is something that it's pretty likely that our kid is going to experience. 2/3 of them do. 1/3 of them report feeling so depressed they had difficulty functioning. This is a very troubling thing. I would love it in your family if you have a conversation about if you find yourself in the pits. I mean, truly in the pits. I have a blog. My blog is kathleensblog.com, no apostrophe. And in there, I have about a blog about talking about suicide and dark times with your kids. We need a code language, family by family, that lets a kid know when they're really having, well, lets us know when our kid's having a hard time. 53%, more than half, admit to feeling hopeless and overwhelmed. Most kids do not graduate in 4 years at an additional cost of about $70,000, lost income, and other college expenses which might be incidental. These are a dose of reality. These are things that, alas, the American College Health Association reports back to us. Under the heading of expecting the unexpected, I'd like to introduce you, maybe you already know about Harlan Cohen's work. It's at his website is harlancohen.com, where you can see his books, his online classes. He has some virtual classes right now, which I did not check out, but which look pretty interesting. He kind of gained his claim to fame with his first book, The Naked Roommate, 107 Other Issues You Might Run Into at College. That could be an interesting one. And lest you think he has overlooked parents, he also has The Naked Roommate for Parents Only, a parent's guide to new college experiences. And I love his attitude, which you can see is pretty tongue-in-cheek, but also which has some excellent, excellent things that you might think through. By the way, could make it a really great graduation gift. I invite you to go look at his website, and there may be some things there that you and your kid might want to look at, and it might give you ways of jumping into topics that you hadn't been able to figure out how to get a conversation going around. I do want to call out to you under the heading of expecting the unexpected. My son had been at college, one of my sons had been at college for maybe 6 weeks, maybe 7. And I got a call one gorgeous fall afternoon from his roommate saying, Mrs. Fisher, I think Will's in the hospital. I was like, what? And I was familiar with the city he was in, and I knew the hospital that his roommate thought he might be in. So I hung up the phone and picked up the phone and called the ER at that hospital. Said, hello, I'm Kathleen Fisher, and I'm wondering if you have my son, Will Fisher, there. And they said, how old would Will be, Mrs. Fisher? And I thought a minute, and I said, 18. You can hear the rest of this conversation, right? They said, well, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Fisher, but your son, Will, would be of majority. So even if he were a patient here, we would not be able HIPAA would preclude our being able to tell you. And I went sputtering off that phone call going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. So let me just save you learning about this. There are 3 documents. And by the way, you'll notice down at the bottom of this page, this comes from the National Law Review, but I certainly encourage you to talk with your own attorney. You may already have these documents in place, but if you don't, I encourage you to consider an HIPAA authorization form. This gives you the ability that I did not have that Sunday afternoon to ask for and receive information about the child care provider's status of your kid, progress, treatment, and so on. This would be particularly important if your kid were unconscious or incapacitated for any length of time. The second one is called Healthcare Power of Attorney. This would name you as their medical agent, so that you could view their medical records, make informed decisions about their care on their behalf. Without this document, I understand that they would, their care would be up to the diagnosis and treatment of a healthcare provider who in another city you may or may not know. And finally, a durable power of attorney. This has to do more with business things like bank accounts, paying bills, breaking or entering into a lease, conducting similar business activities. Now, I am not a lawyer, so I do not know any further than what the National Law Review advises, but I would certainly encourage you to take a look at these things, to talk with your attorney. And I wouldn't even be above, if I had an entering freshman, I would say, hey baby, before I pay your tuition, I need to have these signed. I need it, you need it. I'm currently negotiating with young adult children far, far away that I need these things for them because God forbid they become ill. I don't have access. I don't have any way of checking in on them. And so while you have a toes to hold to the fire, I suggest hold those little toes and get out the signing pen. These are important, and hopefully you will never need them, but you need to have them in case of the unexpected. On a much smaller scale, and I want you to think a little bit about expecting the unexpected. Academically speaking, you or he may be expecting that he'll get about the same grades he got in high school, but you know what? He may not. If he has ramped up his academic pressure, even if he hasn't, it may take him a while to get in sync. He is learning far more than academics at this when he heads off to be a freshman. And he may be so caught up in learning about roommates and dorm social life and meeting girls and getting involved in clubs that academics are very low, and you'll see that reflected in his grades. Your assumption or expectation, or his, may be that professors are thrilling teachers, only to go into Psych 101, which has 1,200 kids in the class and is incredibly boring. He may be expecting he'll meet lifelong friends, or that his long distance relationship with that girl will last. He may be expecting, and you may be expecting, that he will not be homesick, or that he'll check in regularly. And those may or may not be true. So it's a good time in this sort of lull before the next transition that you begin to think about, what are your expectations, what are his, and are those reasonable? We know better. We know some of those expectations are going to crash and burn. And the question is, how can we help in a new way? First of all, I'd like to recommend that we view our role changing. We are no longer the parent who is fixing, solving, recommending, demanding. We are shifting. And remember, this is a clutch and accelerator thing. So it's not like all at once tomorrow. But we are moving into our role as a coach, an advisor, a guide. And the undergirding question in that may be, how can we help promote their thinking, their solving, their coming up with an experiment and a solution? There's an excellent handout, an excellent book that I use called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. I don't know why it never occurred to me that our questions set into play what is going to happen next. Okay, so in this situation, Mary Lee Adams is the author of that book. She often begins with a question, what do you want? How will you know when? What would be a yellow flag, or what would be a benchmark of progress? Okay, I'm really going to study harder because I've got a D in chem. Okay, what will be a benchmark of progress? How will you know things are getting better? One of Mary Lee Adams' favorite questions, and I love this for late adolescents, young adults, is what are they, that other person? What are they thinking, wanting, and feeling? What is that roommate? What is that fraternity brother? What is that coach thinking, wanting, and feeling? We're inviting our kids to do something that is sort of new in late adolescence, and that is thinking about that other person, figuring out what their motivations are, and then fashioning my behavior or response with that in mind. Now, we don't always get it right. They don't always get it right, but it's a new way of thinking. And then, what are you thinking of trying next? What do you consider trying next? And we offer that very loosely, hopefully without judgment. Well, I thought you were going to blah, 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 blah. How'd that turn out? Can that. Watch your tone of voice. Watch your tone of voice. I have one client in coaching who says, got to watch my face. Got to watch my face. Indeed, we all do. One of my favorite questions with my clients, with my children, and certainly as a parent, as I'm thinking about you and your kid, is what do you need right now? Asking your kid, what do you need right now? And sometimes a subtext in that is, are you calling to complain? Are you calling to vent? Now, I have to credit Lisa DeMore in her book, Untangled. So great if you've got adolescent girls, but pretty darn good for adolescent boys too, for teaching me the difference between complaining. DeMore writes, complaining is code for something is awful and somebody needs to fix it. Okay, when our kids complain as little children, you and I just jumped in and went about fixing it. Sometimes they didn't even ask, we just fixed it, right? As they got older and older, when they complained, if we jumped in, sometimes they turn on us and say, Mom, leave me alone, I'll take care of it, I don't need you. Because all they needed was venting. And venting is quite different. Venting is code for, I need someone who cares to listen. Okay, let's go back and look at that. Complaining is, somebody needs to fix this. Venting is, I need somebody who cares to listen. So when they call you, your first question, whether you ask it out loud or not, is, I wonder if they're complaining that if something needs to be fixed, or I wonder if they're venting. Because if they're venting and you're listening, you are doing what is necessary. Okay, so this is a pretty baseline kind of question. I also want to share with you, and I so wish I could remember her name. She's a principal at a Philadelphia Independent School District who was assigned the most dangerous high school in the United States of America. More homicides, more assaults than any other high school. How'd you like that? Surprising to me anyway, being from that neighborhood, she actually put herself forward before they were getting ready to close the school completely to be the principal, to see what she could do to turn it around. She gives a TED Talk. And I loved her comment so much. Now, keep in mind, please, that these children in this school have actually come from the very worst possible circumstances. Their mother is a prostitute. Their dad did get shot selling drugs. Their parents are addicted. They do get abused before they come to class every day. Okay, these kids really do have it bad. She reports in her TED Talk that when they come in to talk with her, she zooms in to pay careful attention to what they're saying. And as they're talking, she listens and she nods empathetically. And she said, oh my gosh, you're right. That is so bad. Dang, that is so sad. And then she listens some more. And then she says, so what? So what? Is that going to define who you are? Is that going to limit your future. It is so bad. It is so sad. So what are you going to do about it? Do you hear embedded in that so what question, self-efficacy, self-reliance? Those are key. And would you believe this woman has flat out turned that school around? I think her comment, so bad, so sad, so what, could do us in pretty good stead as we hear our kids having difficulties. I want to shift gears again from preparing for the unexpected to a word about transition, change, and grief. There is probably no other period of life that is so full of transitions as young adults. Now, the truth is, some of us love transitions. We want to turn things upside down about every 10 minutes. And some of us hate transitions. Some of us do it pretty well, pretty fluently. Some of us resist, resent. And I'd like to encourage you to begin to think about how the people in your family do transitions. Some of them anticipate them eagerly, some of them dread them, some of them plan, some of us make lists and maps and all that kind of stuff. Some of us ignore it. Some of us distract ourselves so we don't have to realize that it's coming. Some of us deny it. Some of us cry. So there are lots of ways of doing this. I do want to remind you that whenever change happens, almost without exception, there's going to be some loss. And wherever loss happens, there's going to be some grief. So the loss might be the kid's not at dinner anymore. The kid's not sitting in his bedroom anymore. I'm not seeing my pals. I'm not seeing my girlfriends on a day-to-day basis anymore. I can't run because it's icy outside. My annoying brother has gone away to college and I can't find him. That actually turns into a loss. Whenever I speak to a group of senior parents, I always bring Kleenex because without exception, I find moms in the group beginning to tear up. We can expect often that our girls will cry or be sad. We can almost expect that our boys are going to be cranky or withdrawn. It's pretty unusual to see a boy demonstrate what looks like sad on the outside. We need to keep in mind that dad is also going through losses and grief. And don't forget about the sibs. It's amazing. I had a friend who's a parent of 5, and she took her oldest child to college. And when she got back, her husband said, well, that's never happening again. She said, what do you mean? He said, next time I'm taking the kid to college, you stay home with the others while they're all crying and mourning and slamming doors. So we're all going through loss, and we're all going through grief as we go through change and transition. I encourage some conversation questions that might begin with, when there isn't a big change, I usually react by what? Now, if you could have this with the whole family at the dinner table, that'd be great. If you could have it with your senior, that'd be great. Do the best you can. How long was your last adjustment period? For example, when you entered St. Mark's, when you went to summer camp, when you did that semester abroad, how long did it take you to complete that adjustment period, and what or who helped you? So that we're beginning to help our kids think about what's in my toolkit. When have I done this before? And then I love this question because it kind of flips the thing on its end. If we were going to make a recipe for bad transitions, what might that include? And if we were together right now, I'd ask you that question. And since you can't answer, some things it might include is not telling anybody, staying in your room by yourself, keeping in touch with your high school kids and not venturing to meet anybody new, skipping meals, not sleeping, gaming all night so that you're exhausted the next day. All of those would go into a recipe for bad transitions. You catch the drift? This would be a great conversation to have. And if you've got other sibs at home, chances are they're going through some transitions. And it might include, besides going to college, what other transitions do family members anticipate before long? Younger brother's going to get a driving license. Younger sister's going to start high school. What other ways has your family members helped you in the past? This is really great because if we're a family and we can think about a team, and we know that hearing from younger brother, hearing from younger sister at school, or older brother, older cousin, was helpful, then we can begin to get a strategy for some things that we might want to consider going down the line. One of my favorite St. Mark's boys, this guy was great. I just love this kid. If you want to know what was going on among the boys, emotionally, socially, emotionally, you could ask this kid and he would just give you a readout in a heartbeat. He was the oldest of 4 sibs, and his mother noticed spring of his senior year. His younger sibs adored him, and he was great with them. He was a wonderful, wonderful oldest brother. But during spring of senior year, and it got worse and worse and worse of summer between senior and freshman year, this kid was getting, first of all, quiet, withdrawn, snarky, snappy. If the younger sibs were annoying, instead of playing them out of it, he would just sort of, snap at them. Finally, she pulled him aside one day and she said, "Son, I noticed that you're kind of snappish and kind of snarky. Are you okay?" And in his typical style, he turned around and he said, "Mom, am I okay? Everybody I know, I'm getting ready to leave. Everything I've been good at, I don't know if I'm going to be good at anymore. This college let me in, but am I going to be able to handle the work? And by the way, I don't even know how I'm going to be sleeping in the same room with. What if I don't like them? Or what if they don't like me? Is everything okay with me? You might say I'm a little edgy, Mom." And I just had to laugh at it. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course he is. Of course he is. We're all going to be in more or less the same environment in 4 to 6 months. He's going to be someplace entirely new, and we might need to cut him a little slack. Finally, I want to point out that there is likely to arrive in your life that unexpected and frankly unwelcome feeling, and that is grief. I remember after my oldest kid left home about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks later, my phone rang one morning and I picked it up to hear the voice of one of my closest friends. She said, "Can you talk a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "I just got back from the grocery store." I said, "Yeah?" She said, "And I didn't buy any applesauce because my applesauce eater is gone and she may never come back." And I thought, oh my goodness, we experience this loss in very particular and peculiar ways. And we need to be aware of the fact that it comes with some grief. And we are allowed to not feel great all the time. I want to quote now from a book called Letting Go, about sending our kids to college. "We shift gears constantly as we meet our offspring in an elusive dance of change. The temptation to tell our kids how to be independent is a compelling one. It's about time you grow up. And by the way, you should follow my advice." Translates to, "It's time for you to be independent, but I don't really trust your judgment." We have to come to terms with their strengths and their limitations. At the same time, we realize that we too are at a watershed, growing older. We may find ourselves taking a new look at our marriage or at our career, at our own limitations, along with the feelings that we have about being left behind. It's a lot of transition going on in these homes. So I was a bit concerned the weekend that I left my son at college. And I have to confess to you, it's him on the right. He looked normal when I left him. I promise you he did. And a few weeks later, when I went to college parents' weekend, that's him sitting in the middle with that beautiful mohawk. Don't you love it? You can't read the t-shirt, but the t-shirt says, "Jesus helps me trick people." Imagine his sisters and my delight when he came home at Thanksgiving, pondering the question, "I can't figure out, Mom, why nobody wants to date me." And my daughter said, "Could it be the mohawk, or could it be the t-shirt?" So I can assure you they do some crazy, crazy things, but I can also assure you that his life has turned out pretty darn well, and mine has too. Oh my gosh, I wish I could send you the photographs of a marksman grown older. It has been a thrilling and exciting thing to watch him take the tools that St. Mark so graciously provided him and build a life. It's so great to talk to other St. Mark's parents, because my son, if he were in on this call today, would say that the best money we ever spent was on St. Mark's. I'm sure St. Mark's would be proud to hear that. And so what is the next thrilling event for you and yours? I'm sure it's going to be exciting. I'm sure it's going to be a very full 6 months. May you celebrate together a great, great sense of expectancy. And I'd like to extend my congratulations to him and to you. It is no small thing. I have to tell you, the night of graduation at St. Mark's, I'd gone through all the hubba, putting the flowers on, tying the bows on the chairs, making sure, on the committee for the punch and all that stuff. And when the evening was over and we'd loaded the chairs back on the dollies to be put away and the lights get turned off, and my husband and I walked to the parking lot, as we stepped off that curb to the parking lot for the last time, there was no small measure of regret. It has been a great, great ride. And I hope that your next piece is as thrilling and exciting as this last piece has been. Congratulations again. Now, I'd like to say that I believe we have the ability to open the chat. Let's see how we can do this. And so if you have a chat open now. Let me see if I can get there from here. Okie doke. Oh, that's so nice. I hear lots of things coming into me. I hear lots of wonderful things. I'd like to say, I believe the chat is open to you right now. And I am going to put it on to coming. I think it's coming just to me. And so what I would love is if you have any things that you would like to enter, somebody send me a question. I'd love to hear if there are some questions. I'm looking on the chat line to see. And let me just see here a minute. Okay, I'm going to allow. I'm not seeing, hang on just a second. I'm not seeing, so what I may do, here's a great question. Do you see the transition period differently this summer than from normal times? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, of course. I think that it is just a function of the fact that we really don't know what to expect. And perhaps what we do is broaden our sense of expectancy. It certainly hinges right now on our kids going away to college. But if it does not include that, what is it about going to college that's so great? Meeting new friends, being away from my parents, living an independent life. Are there any of those elements in the absence of going away in the fall that we could still have as we are? So I think we got some big question marks. I want to say something else about that. Since the day that your kid was a little toddler and they just learned to walk and they were kind of wobble, 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 and they were running and their feet got to going too fast. And then they fell and they turned around and they were about to burst into tears and they turn around to see what your face says. And if you said, oh my gosh, you know what happened next? They burst into tears. And if you said, uh-oh, dust off, hop up, you're okay. They kind of got up and they dusted off. They thought it was pretty bad, but mom says it might be okay. I guess it's okay. From that moment forward, when our kids take a tumble, they turn around and look over their shoulder at you, at me, at dad. How bad is this? So we got some work to do because right now some of it's pretty bad. And yet there's some resilience. And how do we do that? And how do we demonstrate it? Somebody just wrote, how do you feel we can help in the uncertainty of college? Yeah, we're trying to find things to look forward to, but that's even less clear at this point. I think living day by day is you're exactly right. We have to stay in the present. You've heard the expression about borrowing trouble from tomorrow. So we got to do that, and we might even set periods of time where we limit ourselves, where we say, okay, we're going to have Fret City for half an hour every morning, and then we're going to shut that down. And we're going to live in the present, and or during that fret time, we're going to come up with some solution or some alternatives. And then we're going to shut it down. I have a friend who, of all things, works in incest, does therapy in incest recovery. And she told me, I asked her one time if we could talk about it in a general way. I didn't want to hear about her clients, but if there was anything she could teach me. And she said, sure, but not after 4:30. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I can't talk about this after 4:30, or I carry it to bed with me. And I think that's a very interesting thing, that if we're talking about some of this and it is distressing us or our kids, that what do you need right now? Remember that favorite question? I need to only talk about this in the morning, or I need to talk about this only until 4:30. And we need to be aware of that in ourselves, and we need to help our kids be aware of it in them. Does that make sense? So to stage our anxiety, our worrying, our fretting, our planning to manageable doses would be helpful. Adjacent to that, if colleges end up in the fall having to do distance learning, how can we help our boys develop their new sense of independence while still living with us? Well, you might want to go back to that list, that checklisted childhood. What were some of those elements of independence? Talking to strangers, solving problems for themselves, doing household chores. I've had some conversation with families whose college kids are home right now. Those kids have been out living an independent life. Now they come home, and it's like we want to fit them back into the compartment that is home. The kids don't do it very well. They kind of resent it. And the parents resent fixing 3 meals a day for somebody who they haven't been cooking for a while. And one of the questions that I've encouraged some of my coaching clients to think about is, if that kid were your roommate, or slightly different perspective, if I were your roommate, would you fix me 3 meals a day? Could I just say, well, look, why don't you go, by the way, why don't you go to the grocery store? I need a box of tissues and I need some new, toothbrush. Would you do it for me? Or would you exchange it if you go to the grocery store this week and I go next week? How can we begin to actually treat them as if they were independent young adults? Part of that goes back to fixing. Part of that goes back to that list of the checklisted childhood, helping them cope. I find one of the most difficult things is when my kids are upset about something, to step away from fixing it and move into that role of asking the good question and realizing that listening is doing something. It's, I need someone who cares about this to hear me vent, and that is part of it. I don't know if there are other questions or not. I don't see any others, and I do see that we are at the end of our time. So I don't know if I know that some people have figured out how to ask questions, so I will assume that we are done with our questions. I thank you again for joining me, and I have left on that final slide oh, one more question. The question is there a way that we can talk about phone use or screen use? The first thing that I would refer you to is Delaney, who produced the movie Screenagers. Delaney Rush, I believe, is her last name. I believe that if you Google Screenagers, you will come to her website, and she offers a Tech Talk Tuesday, which is a blog about how to address screen and tech issues with your kid. The thing I actually love about her blog is that she's not just talking about kids. She's talking about the way families address screen issues, because frankly, Some of us are addicted to our phones and our screens. Dad may have trouble putting away his phone at the dinner table. And she raises some great ways of approaching that conversations. One of my questions is, what's good for you right now? Is this the best? You're a young adult. You're in charge of this. I have actually wondered, because I know especially boys are probably gaming more than they've ever gamed, and we're letting them do it. And I get that. I would to some extent. But what does a balance look like? And you're a young adult. It's time for me to be out of balancing your life business. It's time for you to be in it. How much physical time do you need? How much social time? How much downtime and creative time do you need? And let's experiment with it. I don't want to be the bad guy, and I don't want to be in charge of limiting your screen time. And by the way, at 18, if they were at college, we sure wouldn't be. So I begin having the conversation about, what do you need? What's best? Some of them, one of their tools in their toolkit, one of their tools is the screen. I get that. It's one of my tools too, but it is not the only tool. And if we become dependent on it as any single tool, we're going to come up short for ourselves. People are being, do you know any good colleges with ADHD support in place for younger kids coming through the pipeline? I would recommend you, yes, there are some. I would recommend you speak to your school counselor. They sure know them. And in Julie Lithcote-Hames' How to Raise an Adult, she has about 20% of her book is devoted to finding the best college for your kid. And in that, she has some that use alternative means of college admissions, and some that provide very, very good support. Yeah. This one is from a family that says, my oldest kid is not doing such a great job of launching successfully, which seems to be creating some pressure on the next kid who is just getting ready to launch. How do I help regain the balance and perspective? How do I help him live his best life versus one that includes making up for an older sib? Gosh, that's a great question. How do I want to answer this the fast way or the slow way? I'm sorry, I've got to answer it the slow way, sorry. Max Lucado, in his book called Cure for the Common Life, uses a metaphor that I love, and this is great for many uses among sibs, and even for ourselves, by the way, in a family. Lucado tells a story of a guy who's invited to speak at an after-dinner talk in another city, and his flight is delayed as leaving his home city, and when he gets to the guest city, it's raining and the traffic is snarled, and he gets to the hotel, which is barely enough time to check in and get ready before they're supposed to come and pick him to speak. So he checks in, he gets up to his room, and he shaves and he showers, and he throws open his suitcase, getting ready to get dressed. And Lucado says in his suitcase is a mini skirt and a blouse with a plunging neckline and stiletto heels. And he poses the question, does the man dress in it? And of course, we know what's happened is he's picked up the wrong suitcase, right? And Lucado goes on to say, each one of us comes into life with a suitcase packed with what we need to be successful. Our job is to figure out what's in the suitcase and what we're called to do with it. Now, I've got a couple of corollaries to that, according to Kathleen Fisher. Number one, most of us spend a very great deal of time looking at what's in other people's suitcases, right? Why didn't I get a sister who would help me with boys? Why aren't I tall enough to spike a volleyball? Why aren't my scores on the college admissions this? I spend all this time looking at what's in other people's suitcases, but I can't build a life from that. I got to build it with what's in my suitcase, right? Corollary number two, every single one of us has something in our suitcase that we wish, if we'd had a chance, we would have thrown out. An alcoholic parent, learning disabilities, a terrible introverted shyness, a sibling who is handicapped who got all the attention, a sibling who didn't do so well and put a lot of pressure on me to perform. Every single one of us has something in our suitcase that, given a chance, we would have discarded. The truth is, it has been my experience in life, and I expect in yours, that even that junk ends up being useful. I have a kid who has learning differences, and to compare his ability with his two siblings is a stark contrast. And I am sure that he would have tossed those learning disabilities out. But I'm here to tell you that they have given him 1 bazillion times the perseverance, the kindness, the patience, the resilience that the other two combined will ever have in a lifetime. It is a gift unique to his suitcase. So as we're looking at SIBs, and they vary in many ways, don't they? They vary in many ways. If you can craft this metaphor and sit down and say, I don't expect you to be sorting and doing from your brother's suitcase or your sister's suitcase. I'm just asking you to look what's in yours. And let's figure out what's in there. And then what are you thinking you're going to do with it? What do you feel called to do with it? That's a whole nother conversation. Gosh, I'd love to be with that later when they're in college, right? What about this summer's lack of jobs? What about opportunities to be productive? I'll refer you to another author I really, really like. Kay Wyma is one of my actual factual pals. And she wrote a book called Cleaning House, One Mother's 12-month Experiment in Ridding Her Family of Youth Entitlement. We could have written that one, right? One of her chapters is on jobs and employment. And what she discovers very early on, of course, is that kids under 16 have trouble getting a job. And in fact, this summer, most kids are going to have trouble getting a job. And Kay fashioned a slightly different spin on this by saying, when she realized her kids couldn't get a job, she went to them and she had the means to do this. Maybe you pay and maybe you don't. She said to her kids, Dad and I value community service, and we believe that part of our obligation as a family is to help within our community. Now, help could be defined in a lot of ways. It could be going to visit grandmother twice a week. It could be driving grandmother's groceries to her. It could be reading to the younger members of the family on Zoom. It could be actually volunteering at the North Texas Food Bank. But Wyma set it up such that for her younger kids, they took on a volunteer job where they committed to work in the summer for 20 hours a week. I want to say one of hers worked at Catholic Charities, babysitting young immigrant children who didn't yet speak English. Oh my gosh, what a job. And she paid them like $2.50 an hour for their volunteer work, because she and her husband said, you're actually fulfilling a family, one of our family obligations. So there are other ways of crafting this that you might not think about. But I do think real work is really important. And if we step away, we say, why? They have to report to another adult. They have to go when they don't like it. They're not always successful, so they have to redouble their efforts. They often get praise outside the home that has nothing to do with us. And that's really a great thing. Builds that sense of self-reliance and that sense of self-efficacy. I can take on a problem and solve it. Somebody says, thanks for the suitcase, going to use it. I am going to sign off now because I'm well over time. I thank you so much for joining me today. And again, I wish you every bit of good luck. I look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully you'll join something I'm doing. So thanks to the moms who invited me, and we will be out. Thank you so much. I'm ending the meeting now.